So I'd like to welcome you all to the CGS Noon Lecture Series. My name is Per Kassel. My day job is Associate Professor of Chinese History and also affiliated with the Center for Japanese Studies. Today we have Professor John Whittier Treat as our speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce him. He's the Professor Emeritus of East Asian Languages and Literature at Yale University and a productive author of both fiction and poetry. He's also taught at Washington, Berkeley, Stanford, Texas, Oslo, Iowa, and Seoul National. He's the author of 6 scholarly books, including Writing Ground Zero, Japanese Literature and the Atomic Bomb, which was awarded a John Whitney Hall Book Prize in 1997 by the Association of Asian Studies. And last year, he completed The Rise and Fall of Modern Japanese Literature. He's currently at work on a study of Korean writers under Japanese rule, tentatively entitled Too Close to the Sun, Korea, Japan, and the Lessons of 20th Century Collaboration. He's currently a Master's of Fine Arts student at Antioch University, Los Angeles, and is currently at work on a second novel, First Consonants, the story of a stutterer who saves the world. Before we welcome Professor Treat, I also want to make an announcement. Next Thursday on November the 7th, Shinji Kono, Professor of Japanese Language and Literature at Seisen University in Tokyo, is speaking on the history of furigana. Please check in the back of the room for flyers and announcements of other events of CGS. So now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Professor Treat. The title of his lecture is Put to the Test, HIV, AIDS, Japan, and Sexual Citizenship. Please give him a heartfelt welcome.
Thank you, Par. It's great to be back in Ann Arbor, one of my favorite places. And before I start, I just want to say what I think is on the minds of many of you this morning, which is the destruction of Shuri Castle due to fire in Okinawa. I just want to say it's been destroyed many times before and always rebuilt. It will be rebuilt again. We're waiting for a report on treasures inside the castle that may or may not have survived the fire. So it's June 2016. I'm in Kyoto to attend a conference, but I'm laid low by sudden illness and have not left my hotel room for several days. Dehydrated by vomiting and diarrhea, I call the front desk and ask for an ambulance to take me to the nearest hospital. One arrives immediately, and I am reminded of how efficient Japanese emergency services can be. This is not my first time needing immediate medical attention in Japan, and the calm professional demeanor of the EMTs, their movements choreographed like dancers, reassure me that I am once more in good hands. They transport me a few blocks to the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital. Emergency room personnel are immediately by my gurney's side as I am wheeled into a cubicle marked off with curtains. Half a dozen medical staff busy themselves with me, easing me into a hospital robe, asking me my symptoms, poking me here and there, asking me my medical history. Tubes appear from nowhere. A high-tech thermometer looking like a ray gun runs across my forehead. Then one young man with a clipboard asks me questions, one of them being who my next of kin is. I reply, my husband. I don't recall exactly how I said it. All conversation was a mumble of Japanese and English, but I might well have said uchi no teishu. It's funny to recall, but it was a speech act with a definite repercussion. Suddenly, the crowd around me stepped back, and some left the cubicle entirely. An older man entered, an older man to whom everyone deferred, He approached my gurney to say, quote, "We cannot proceed without administering you an HIV test first." From this point on, I recall everything perfectly. "No," I said firmly, "you may not. This is ridiculous. But the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital makes it clear. Either we test you or you leave." In subsequent days, dogged research on my part will reveal that there was an incident at this hospital some years ago that resulted in this unique policy. Universal precautions thrown to the winds, in other words, and the testing of homosexuals substituted. No one asked me if I had patronized a sex worker, or was a hemophiliac, or used drugs intravenously. Be gay, however, and medical assistance is withheld until you are proven negative, which no male homosexual ever really can be. HIV negative identity is semi-mythical. Since the 1980s, foreign homosexuals in Japan have been effectively Haitianized. If HIV didn't exist, heterosexism would invent something like it anyway. And it always has, because our sexuality remains lethal. As David Halperin, here at the University of Michigan, asserts, just when homosexuality was ceasing to be considered a sickness, just at that moment a new syndrome, that of the psychologically afflicted gay individual who knowingly seeks to be infected or to infect others with HIV, has restored to homosexuality its venerate identity as a disease. Others have already richly documented the xenophobic, heterosexist, and misogynist legacy of HIV/AIDS discourse in Japan. Today, I want to move on to the theme of sexual citizenship, a concept pioneered by LGBT scholars because while citizenship, I prefer the term actually state personhood, because I think it's more accurate. Citizenship might once have appeared gender and sexuality neutral, but it is anything but. Hegemonic forms of heterosexuality underpin constructions of citizenship for the simple reason it is inheritable by our children. But let me insert here, as a preface to my remarks today, just what an HIV test promises. There is no test quite like it. Every negative test feels like a suspended sentence. Simon Watney termed it, quote, a poisoned chalice. It is a predictive diagnostic test which has created a new medical limbo between illness and health, even in the most enlightened places, which the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital is not. Never in history have the results of a blood test acquired such widely experienced, profound, and ambiguous social, interpersonal, and psychological meanings. The word blood here is key for several reasons, one of which is it's real in ethno-national countries such as Germany and Japan, and metaphoric, as in, say, civic France and the United States, in constituting the definition of citizenship. Michel Foucault spoke of blood in the West as one of the fundamental values. Quote, power spoke through blood, the blood of war. Red is the color in both the Japanese and American national flags, and in each it signifies blood. When we used to say our blood must be tested, it meant for patriotic courage on the battlefield. In peacetime, one of the ways today we fulfill our obligations as citizens has been to donate blood. But homosexuals were and still are prohibited from doing so. Blood banks in over 40 countries ban donations by gay or bisexual men. And if you're my age, you may remember the question we were asked as we waited our turn at the bloodmobile. Quote, "Are you a male who has had sexual contact with another male even once since 1977? But in the Kyoto Red Cross Hospital, we weren't talking about millimeters of blood, just a little pinprick. What choice did I have? What kind of consent could I give, heaving and defecating in the emergency room? What is really being tested, it's been asked? The limits of control that can be exerted over our bodies, the limits of constraint that can be placed on our actions. Informed consent, by the way, is honored almost entirely in the breach in Japan, in any case. My blood, like my vomit and my feces, is included in the bodily effluvia that Julia Kristeva said calls up abjection. In other words, I fully qualified. It was there, as something was being done to my pinprick of blood behind the curtain, that I experienced for the first time abjection, what the Japanese might call ozomashiki mono, and defined by our colleague in Japan Studies, Rachel Dumas, after Kristeva, as, quote, a traumatic confrontation with an object that, though somehow familiar to the viewing subject, is envisioned as defiled due to its existence outside of the symbolic order, that is, the realm of knowledge in which the viewing subject's self-conceptualization is embedded, end quote. My objection in the hospital's emergency room, however, was social and not psychoanalytical. The staff's repugnance, fear, and disgust, things Kristeva says are close to abjection, were manifest. Yet I don't believe it was psychoanalytical. Abjection for gay men, to quote David Halperin again, does not originate in psychic causes. It is the consequence of society's collective judgment against us. We have to use this word, abjection, judiciously, remembering that Rosalind Krauss warned us about, quote, the insistent spread of abjection as an expressive mode. Katsuhiko Suganuma, in writing of the outspoken Japanese activist Togo Ken, describes Togo's bold speech act, I am Togo, I am Okama, as evidence of his living in an abject space, in Kristeva's sense. I prefer to say of a Japanese man shouting in the streets that he is a homo in somewhat different terms, and in one that refuses induction into any newly receptive order of citizenship. I was, after all, in that emergency room, precisely that alien element that Judith Butler claims Kristeva's notion of abjection establishes through expulsion. And I was most certainly expelled one way or another. Wendy Brown writes, just when polite liberal, not to mention correct leftist discourse ceased speaking of us as dykes, faggots, colored girls, or natives, we began speaking of ourselves this way. Refusing the invitation to absorption, we insisted instead upon politicizing and working into cultural critique the very constructions that a liberal humanism increasingly exposed in its tacit operations of a racial, sexual, and gender privilege, which was what was seeking to bring to a formal close. And I might add, the privilege of being HIV negative, which is one entitlement that can be withdrawn at any time. Indeed, HIV testing, not to say the whole life of the homosexual in society, engenders abjection. The virus is one alien thing that cannot be expelled or made abject, only its hosts. Abjection, Kristeva says, is above all ambiguity, but a confirmed HIV test is anything except that. You are a plus or you are a minus, and there is nothing in between. In the words of one young Japanese gay man after his positive test, this body doesn't just belong to me. Of course not. Cindy Patton told us our bodies have been pressed to assume a different affect, not just in relation to each other, but in relation to our nation. It belongs to the state, especially so since it must be disciplined by authority, in part invested in medical care, in lieu of any gay man's alleged promiscuity. For a foreigner, that abjection is multiplied. Abjection at the national border, writes Philip Frode, is sustained by a view of HIV as a threat to the security of the national body, and perhaps so in few places as much as Japan, where HIV has long been characterized as a disease from without. For me, a positive test at the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital would result in my forced exile, sick, from the hospital. For others who test positive, it entails such losses as getting fired, discharged from the military, losing health insurance, being expelled from the family, and abandonment by a spouse or lover. But for me, an American male homosexual visiting Kyoto, it would gain Japan a more secure purchase of its allegedly monoracial and homophobic concept of what it means to be a Japanese. And to do so, that emergency room would have to render me abject. That test proved an invaluable tool in erecting an illusory border demarcating the HIV-infected from the allegedly impervious. So I declined to be an unruly body in that emergency room, much as I wanted to smash things. I submitted to the test because I was sick, and in any case, the doctors and nurses had surely decided I was already an unruly body because of what I do with it in bed. I was compliant, and therefore, to everyone's evident satisfaction in that semi-public, semi-private place of the emergency room, abject. Living today, as we do in the age of urinal politics, aren't we all tested against our wills all the time? And even before we know it. With the prospect of the rewriting of personhood at the genetic level, every fetus with a possibly queer future is now at risk, at the mercy of prenatal screening for whatever they decide is the gay gene. Abjection, like trauma, like affect, is one of those words that was bandied about in literary studies for years before I paid it any attention. These theories of disgust, as they've been called, all move too quickly to the psychoanalytical for me. Homosexual men, like all women, don't fare well under Freud. I never paid disgust much heed. But since that day, I have, as I have the boom in the contemporary field of citizenship studies, the new black, it's even been called, which has flourished at the same time as gay people, immigrants, and others have sought rights promised citizens when the nation state, in the midst of globalization, can no longer guarantee or even precisely define. It's an open question whether we have the right to rights at all. But while we ponder that question, Toby Miller has written, "The intensification of neoliberal globalization via a global division of labor, regional trading blocs, globally oriented cities with supranational ambitions, international TV markets, and the spread of conflictual religious relations has taken citizenship out of the narrow confines of the sovereign state and linked it to universal rights. Something has happened to citizenship, Lauren Berlant understates in the first sentence of her well-known book on the topic. I will grant that we may be in a crisis of belonging, but why citizenship? Why now? Why this attempt at rapprochement with the state? Citizenship, it's been said, once presumed a gradual extension of rights based upon a naturalized trajectory that would lead individuals toward heterosexuality, gender complementarity, and increased social and political investment, has become more complicated as the word citizenship is increasing any type of civil participation. The position taken, for example, by undocumented citizens. But read what Carl Steichen had to say. Citizen has never meant inhabitant. It always counterposes some others who are present but not full citizens, at best visitors, but usually also racial, ethnic, and sexual minorities, slaves, criminals, the lower classes, women, children, the elderly. In our Enlightenment inheritance, the nation is an unstable construct, and the ideas of citizenship are deployed typically in a hegemonic process whereby outsiders are stigmatized and potential deviants jostled into place. Today, a still normative concept of citizenship moves away from that in a community, a nation, of individuals, and toward one of families, an effort, I believe, intended to exclude those of us not in one. In this liberal world of sovereign states and individualities, Lauren Berlant comments, we witness the alchemical fantasy of concepts such as the nation, citizenship, family, or the umbrella notion of the good life itself, end quote. Against this, there are, of course, efforts to define the family with new systems of kinship, stretching the definition of the word beyond the reproduction of progeny. And so we get Rosie O'Donnell telling us that love makes a family, reinstituting entirely conventional coupledom as the basis for citizenship. Pity, in other words, the unloved single person. There was a time when feminists and gay liberationists thought, viewed as an arm of the state, it was clear the family had to go. Now, love propels us into the arms of that same state. Cindy Patton says, turning the love that dared not speak its name into families we choose or alternative families, the love we frame or alternative love, or even that most fraught move, the love that knows no borders, cannot extricate us from the tendency of love to return us to the nation, to a nation that would rather maintain itself as the central love object than give all its people the tools they would need to survive an epidemic. For reasons I will summarize, I do not believe that the marriage equality movement or the sexual citizen movement will succeed in even a fraction of their subversive ambitions, if they have any. After the evisceration of the last bits of the welfare state, the dregs of such in the United States, writes Yasmin Nair, the message is clear: marry or die. The past decade has seen the articulation of new desires for sexual citizenship, writes Kane Race and his colleagues in Australia. While political mobilization around this objective has produced new forms of moralism within gay and lesbian communities. The neoliberal state is highly motivated to domesticate the sexual outlaw via new social practices such as oxymoronic gay marriage. Citizenship, according to Letty Volpe, quote, is an ironic choice of solution to the problem of cultural difference. There is a curious circularity, I think, at work here. Student of history, frankly, I become quite concerned when the state becomes interested in any kind of intimacy. For me, a survivor of AIDS, my kinship chart will always be the buddy system, which is how we got through the 80s and 90s. Not as citizens, not even as radical ones, no, not by a mile, but as our own civil society with no sanction from the state in sight. Abjection is always the premise of citizenship, since groups define what they are by ruling what they are not. I refer you, for example, to Miriam Kingsburg's work on the moral panic that attended awareness of the widespread use of amphetamines in Japan following on the footsteps of the return to quasi-sovereignty in Japan after the American occupation from 1945 to 1952. The addict, a stereotype of powerlessness, was a fitting symbol, she writes, of a defeated country adrift from its value system. He or she was at once a helpless victim, a prisoner of anxiety, a bullied inferior, and above all, a deeply flawed, even strange personality. The addict, unlike the permanently positive HIV positive homosexual Japanese, could, with treatment, be retrieved from abject dependence and made an independent citizen in what the Japanese call the Hiroponjidai, the Fellopan age, eventually faded from public scrutiny by 1955-56. But it is germane to my discussion here that the media panic over drug use focused on the role of that famously ambiguous citizenship category in post-war Japan, the third country national, a euphemism for former colonial subjects still residing in Japan, as the blameworthy purveyors of debilitating and addictive drugs. These third country nationals were easily imprisoned or expelled. But what to do with the homosexuals? Homosexuality, and for much longer, enjoyed a kind of hip allure that drug use did. Think of such celebrity addicts in the literary world as Dazai Osamu. And it endures an equally long abject rejection from citizenship. Without fluency in the lingo 20 years ago, I explored these issues in my book about AIDS panic in 1980s Japan, Great Mirrors Shattered. Apropos 1985, the year 4 of AIDS and the year I returned to Japan to live, I wrote, "We believed Tokyo existed solely for us. We were young and hip, if foreign and gay as well as young, hipper still. If foreign and gay and young all at once, then just too damn hip. If we had money, all the better. But in those days, many things were negotiable currency. We had the style and the nerve to act up in a faraway place that granted us the freedom of the foreigner and made hedonism heroic. That thin slice of years, spent in the company of friends with a bounty of good taste and bravado, was when we ricocheted between bars and clubs and restaurants and parties of a Tokyo we arrogantly thought had only entered the international homosexual grand tour with our lucky belated arrival." But the conflation in Japan of AIDS, homosexuality in America in the wake of HIV disillusioned me of that romance, of being a foreigner, but one at home because I was a gay one, a lesson that the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital confirmed to me in 2016. Japanese society, Wim Lunzink says, quote, has long provided niches for those who feel they cannot live like everyone else. Lunzing writes that when he first arrived in Japan in 1986 at age 25, he immediately and uncannily felt at home, a common experience perhaps for white male homosexuals. But by 1986, in the early years of the AIDS pandemic my experience was no longer that. What Jeffrey Weeks has called the invisible college of gay intellectuals, quote, who were alive to a translocal sense of alignment which went before national borders, had become eminently testable. Ironically, it is just our nomadic status, like Jews and gypsies, that has made the homosexual the perfect anti-citizen. Sexual citizenship, like the discourse of abjection a la Kristeva and her, quote, dubious speculations about the human psyche, has a late 20th century provenance, and for a good reason. Recent theories of citizenship have led to a broadening out of the concept beyond formal citizenship as a member of a nation state to include considerations of belonging and associated practices of citizenship that go beyond traditional rights-based understandings, like intimate citizenship and nomadic citizenship. The sexual citizen is a term that maps the transversal nonlinear areas of post-national identification. This is not voluntarist. People do not go around saying, I want to be a sexual citizen today, in the same way I might say I want to be an American. The concept of individual choice is a key aspect of Western models of neoliberal citizenship, but I didn't really have a choice in whether to be tested or not in the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital. But you probably are a sexual citizen if you belong to a sexual minority. The sexual citizen is now, as has been said, a culturally legible figure. There is a primacy given to sexual subjectivity in the contemporary world, and in hindsight, this was inevitable once sexuality became a basis for identity within communities of like sexual topologies. And so we got Queer Nation in the early 1990s, which in my opinion was immediately camp because we are anything but a nation. If living under a regime of abjection can be contrarily productive, as claimed by some theorists, it is in part because it is guaranteed to produce camp or a close cousin. But make no mistake, Queer Nation, the confrontational stepchild of New York's ACT UP in the early 1990s, deployed the word nation with its own exclusionary message. Not queer? Then you can't come into our clubhouse. Didn't last long. As Pauline Rankin has pointed out, Queer Nation produced its own homogeneity, queer, and its own heterogeneity, nation. And the combination proved unstable. Since queer, after all, now is a club anyone can join, this organization was gone within a decade. The second half of the 20th century, wrote David Evans in 1993, has seen a pronounced escalation in already well-established sexualization of developed capitalist societies at all structural levels. Sure. If what gay people wanted was liberation, what we got was a lifestyle. But HIV, at root nothing capitalist as opposed to its profitable treatment, created new and affirmed old dividing lines among us. Sexual citizenship provides a method for addressing how social expectations, such as HIV prevention responsibilities and obligations, are brought into the sexual practices of individuals. This concept also works in reverse, providing the basis for exploring how sexual practices are politicized and have implications for citizenship. Homosexuals often buttressed or even created the category of national citizen by virtue of their exclusion, and I refer you to the history of immigration into the United States. where mid-last century the homosexual fairly epitomized the non-citizen. Michael Brown, in his book AIDS Activism and Radical Democracy, took Vancouver as his example of historically how citizenship grew to be articulated with an emerging gay subjectivity. And in Vancouver, AIDS became the first material issue related to identity politics for gay men in the city. But suddenly, in the midst of our health crisis, gay men and others needed access to the resources of the state to combat our disease. Given the exclusionary history of citizenship, wrote Carl Steichen, it is perhaps surprising how it has come to be embraced within lesbian, gay, and queer political theory. No, not at all. We needed new drugs, we needed hospital wards, and we needed plots in municipal cemeteries. When some people with AIDS said they wanted their corpses thrown over the White House fence, they were appealing to the power of the state to save them. It was hard to be both a client and a citizen in the days before the cocktail. At the same time, there is no doubt in my mind that the diversion of gay resources to marriage equality was inspired by the desire among some homosexuals to be readmitted to the body politic as good citizens rather than infected pariahs. Marriage, noted Laura Kipnis, is meant to function as a boot camp for citizenship instruction. And marriage, Sarah Ahmed observes cynically, quote, is a big part of the current happiness turn. In the United States, the right to a same-sex marriage, in my opinion, is juridically more secure than a woman's right to an abortion, especially given the pro-life movement's nomination of the fetus as a citizen. It is also my view that if all homosexuals happened to be female, misogyny would have guaranteed there'd be no such thing as marriage equality. But HIV continues to throw a wrench into the works. Medical anthropologist John Willis put it wryly. My HIV diagnosis identified my unreliable citizenship of the state of emergency. The AIDS epidemic, Willis writes, has been central to redefinitions of sexual citizenship. But at the same time, I would say that this raises an awkward question about queer citizenship. What do we do with all the unsafe sex guys? When Willis wondered in 2011 whether there might not be, quote, a third way, a new kind of HIV-positive citizenship, perhaps it did not occur to him that the barebackers, the guys who like it raw, had already been trying that. For some, the barebacker identity supplanted the gay one and formed the basis of a new kind of intimate citizenship, defined by sociologist Ken Plummer as, quote, all those matters linked to our most intimate desires, pleasures, and way of being in the world. If in the early 20th century, immigration officials did not regard homosexuals to be the kind of self-governing individuals worthy of admission to the nation because of our lack of sexual self-discipline, barebacking is heir to that logic and reason for barebackers' withdrawal from state citizenship. Is viral sex the political vanguard of a post-gay world? Asked Gregory Tomso 10 years ago. But he was late to the party. If being sexually carnivalesque is an amendment to citizenship, or even its proposed alternative, well, that gets old quickly. There's a line near the end of Tony Kushner's Angels in America that goes, quote, we won't die secret deaths anymore. The world only spins forward. We will be citizens. The time has come. In my view, this is entirely wishful thinking. The citizen pervert is always going to be a problem. HIV is often said to be producing new forms of politics and subjectivity, but citizenship, I predict, will be one of the most fleeting of them. Corinne Squire writes, "The forms of citizenship articulated around HIV are likely to be limited and contingent, defined, for instance, by geographical area, social categories such as class, gender, sexuality, and drug use, by particular goals of treatment or education, or by health status. Even transnational HIV citizenships tend to be incomplete and transitory, depending on specific historical and political links. Sexual citizen, like gay marriage or its close cousin, undocumented citizen, are finally oxymoronic. Band-aids wrapped around moribund concepts, citizen, marriage, to keep them alive a bit longer. Personally, I stand with critics such as Diane Richardson, who say sexual citizenship is, quote, a concept that is increasingly used uncritically in ways that risk depoliticizing, I would add dehistoricizing, social relations, which are, of course, only partially, and a small part at that, sexual. Let me return to Japan, a country which runs a testing clinic in Hawaii for its nationals too timid to seek help in their own country, and why a YouTube video made by an African American living in Tokyo is necessary to find one's way to the only place in Tokyo for anonymous HIV testing, because it is hidden from view. In an otherwise stereotype-filled New Yorker piece on HIV/AIDS in Japan, Stan Sesser wrote, "A visitor to Tokyo quickly notices that something is missing. Well, is sexual citizenship one of those missing things? The gay movement in Japan is largely focused on how to individualize jikoshucho, gay lives, without the perspective of how individualization is indeed how modern states tether their power to us. Observers outside of Japan can take a cue in answering this question of missing sexual citizenship from Vera Mackey, whose insight that, quote, questions of sexual citizenship are particularly acute when individuals travel across national borders, is something my experience at the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital bore out. Mackey provincializes the Western concept of Western citizenship when she writes, "The changing relationships between women, men, and the state can be brought into focus effectively by considering the concept of citizenship, a concept which has received increasing attention from political scientists in recent years. Citizenship is generally discussed in the context of the legal right to participate in the political systems of voting and elected governments, but not quite for homosexuals, for whom legal rights do not guarantee any sense of full participation in society or even belonging. The Japanese homosexual is an abject sexual citizen, even if he is seldom described as such at home. When HIV professionals in Japan invoke unique aspects of Japanese culture to explain how AIDS in Japan appeared in ways unique in the world, to explain complacency among Japanese men, or when a gay historian says AIDS only became a problem in Japan because the country's male homosexuals can only have sex furtively, we know we are in trouble. Just as when authorities in the United States suggest that unprotected sex between American men is, quote, a reflection of the values of individual choice and individual responsibility on which Western cultures are based. Orientalism enough for everyone. To wit, the academic discourse on homosexuality in Japan, notes Claire Murray, quote, is a jumbled notion of unique queer ingenuity where the borders of sexual citizenship are heavily patrolled. The social segregation of AIDS patients in the Japanese healthcare system has its parallel in the social segregation of the out homosexual. Anthropologist Shingai Akitomo has described how the emergence of a resident Japan gay community, defined as, quote, a recently evolved notion limited to large urban areas of postmodern industrial societies, first named in 1993 and linked to biological citizenship, was prompted by the 1980s AIDS crisis in Japan. It is a community that sits only precariously both within and without the borders of the Japanese nation-state. As Susan Burns details in her new book, Kingdom of the Sick, A History of Leprosy and Japan, where the term biological citizenship is used in conjunction with Japan's policies towards Hansen's disease, just as its modern state was coalescing in the second half of the 19th century. Lepers then, and HIV-positive homosexuals now, are communities that sit within and without, precariously, the borders of the Japanese koka. As elsewhere, homosexuals had to seek the resources of the state while undermining it at the same time. Japanese who now call themselves gay or rezu may be seeking to replace national citizenship with something less national and more global. In Japan, if you want to see an example of HIV status, the symbology of blood in citizenship, abjection in homosexuality, look no further than the work of HIV-positive drag queen poet Hasegawa Hiroshi. Positive since at least 1992, before effective retroviral treatment, Hasegawa has never hid his disease or felt shame or remorse over it. Founder of the Japan Network of People Living with HIV/AIDS, Hasegawa is my age, but in poor health, diagnosed with diabetes as well as AIDS, and confined to a wheelchair. He lives in public housing and relies on the care of friends. 40 clinics declined to treat him before he found one that would. HIV, he has written, is not a pleasant disease. But he continues to publish as a self-identified Joso Shijin, a transvestite poet. One of his poems, using his drag name, is entitled Bearine de Pink's Confession Number 2, The Problem of Blood. And it's a very long work, but I'm going to show you the first 3 stanzas from it. Now, I'll read my translations. Perhaps you don't know it yet, but there flows in my veins the blood of that moral degenerate. Perhaps you don't know it yet, but there flows in my veins the virus that causes AIDS. The blood that flows through my body is the same red blood as yours. Hasegawa's message to the reader is clear. He is an okama, a faggot, and he has a sexually transmitted disease that might kill him. But he appeals to a nonke, straight readership to acknowledge a shared humanity that is also a shared citizenship, narrowly that of his fellow Japanese, but at its broadest, all men and women. Japanese social science has never been kind to homosexuality. Ueno Chichizuko called it unnatural, and Doi Takeo considered it a pathology. In a Japanese media world where we are either Osugi and Piko or Miwa Akimono, where, as Mark McClellan has said, quote, the media conflation of homosexuality with transgenderism has led to the popular idea that gay people are easily recognizable and therefore rare. Gay men in Japan become visible at a price, James Valentine has written. They are visible as risible. They are not, as gay writer Hashimoto Osamu puts it simply, ichinin mai, or complete people, a fact before which Hasegawa, our poet, does not feel abject, but has decided is going to be, well, positive. Homosexual men in Japan are aware of being trapped in someone else's discourse, observed Mark McClellan. These discourses are primarily the product of heterosexual fantasy, which means our gay sexuality is typically seen as an adjunct to the straight woman's. Which means, it is not surprising then that AIDS discourse is similarly confused. But in the popular imagination, it is not only the male homosexual who's cast in the role of the source of HIV infection. As with so many other touted social, demographic, and economic ills in present-day Japan, it is focused, one Japan anthropologist calls it the media's maniacal obsession, on the body of the young Japanese heterosexual female, the shoujo, who reputedly refuses to marry and bear children, but indulges in epidemiologically dangerous assisted dating and jokosai. Feminist Mackie is onto this. Political science's traditional take on citizenship as a set of legal structures do not, in Mackie's estimation, exhaust the discourse on citizenship in Japan or elsewhere. And let me cite as an example Deep Love, Ayu no Monogatari, a 2002 work of fiction referenced in the secondary literature as the first keitai shosetsu, or cell phone novel, but which is also a cautionary tale about AIDS, as well as about drug and alcohol addiction, abuse, pregnancy, and other popular social ills. Ayu is a 17-year-old high school girl alienated from her family and with an intravenous drug-using boyfriend. Plus, she has a hobby. She charges 50,000 yen for her time. None of her older male clients hesitate to pay her steep fees, for which she engages in emotionless, risky sex, once culminating in a gang rape and, in her most abject scene, intercourse with her best friend's drunk father. Old men, the novel says, played with her body as if it were a toy. Well, a third of the way through the novel, Ayu begins to appear thin, but dismisses this early symptom of wasting. She will develop a persistent respiratory illness, first signaled when she coughs out a customer's semen after a blowjob and is diagnosed with AIDS. Her corpse is discovered at home by a municipal employee and is discreetly buried. Her stepfather remarks it was a death she had coming. Aitsurashi shinikata dana. In an afterword, the author of Deep Love, author Yoshi, who is a man who says he wrote this to make money, says he also wrote it to, quote, contribute to the eradication of AIDS. But in fact, all he actually did was sensationalize it as a warning to women and as a tutorial in how to surrender claims of membership in a putative, healthy Japanese citizenship. The novel, wrote one Japanese literary scholar without irony, quickly went viral. There is a way, has written Frenchie Lumming, to understand the feminine in shoujo culture as an expression not only of Christavan abjection, but also of abjection in the everyday, poignant sense of the word. Lumming goes on to say that abjection is evidenced in the fear of seepage between the inner psychic states and the outer body. For shoujo bodies, the menstrual blood of the mature female body represents this seepage. If true, this is where the shoujo's blood comes together with Hasegawa's in his poem, and with mine in the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital. Our shared abjection makes our citizenship anywhere tricky to the point of inutility because no borders can be secured around it. Kristeva would have it that modernity, quote, has learned to repress, dodge, or fake abjection. For her, quote, abjection does not signify living an unbearable life on the margins of social visibility, but something more akin to the writer's quest, the holy grail of the avant-garde. Well, not in my experience, nor that of my Japanese gay friends and colleagues. Modernity might be built upon abjection. Citizenship, which is why I'm not interested in defending or reforming it, is. Sexual citizenship only emerged when critiques of the notion of national citizenship itself became many. It is hard to interpret it as other than a defensive reaction. To claim full citizenship for dissident sexual minorities, argues Jeffrey Weeks, is to argue for the transformation of the concept. But he might have it backwards. Perhaps we have sexual citizens because the concept is already transformed and not the other way around. I appreciate the desirability to extend the domain of citizenship today in a world with more refugees and stateless persons than at any time since the Second World War. Martha Nussbaum's immediately mocked idea of being a citizen of the world in lieu of being an American citizen is not an option unless there is a world state, a world government, and I'm not sure we would like one. Advocates for gay sexual citizenship make the argument that we are configured as non-choosing sexual subjects, where sexuality is understood to be either naturally determined or God-given, that rights of sexual citizenship are consequently inalienable. I don't agree. The struggle between gay rights advocates and queer theorists can quite properly be seen as a debate over citizenship. Whether or not the homosexual can or should be a citizen is very much at the center of the debate between queer theorists and those associated with gay and lesbian politics. My position is that we should reject citizenship and fight the normalization, legitimization, and regulation that comes with it. With Diane Richardson, I contend, quote, it is largely through being configured as non-choosing sexual subjects where sexuality is understood to be either naturally determined or God-given, that the rights of sexual citizenship have been advanced. There is, I put it to you, no embodied claim to justice. Like marriage, citizenship makes no sense unless someone is excluded and deprivileged because of it, and I'll give Richardson the last word on that. Indeed, it can be argued that, associated with the normalization of LGBT equality we have witnessed in many parts of the world over the past decade or so, there has been a re-essentializing of sexuality within a largely uncritical return to the essentialist notion of sexual orientation, with associated assumptions about fixity and universality, despite all the talk of fluidity and change in the literature. If citizenship or world-making of any kind is always about coping with human finitude, there are other and less exclusionary ways of managing that. I understand the need for us to talk about citizenship when the state invokes the notion against us, but let's not make it our own. The foundations of national citizenship and the basis of individual entitlement remain legally and socially connected with biological reproduction and hence with the family and heterosexuality. As a gay man, frankly, I am more interested in sexual consumption than production, so I am never going to make a very good citizen. We may be allowed to do citizen things, like get married and raise children and fight wars, but we are not really citizens. Before we led an enviable lifestyle, before we could have families, before we needed exorbitantly priced drugs to stay alive, it was much cheaper to be gay than straight. Capitalism, I think, found this situation intolerable and made us all consumers, which is what we are today. That doesn't make our lives necessarily better. What makes for a livable world is no idle question, Judith Butler told us, as if we didn't know. It is not merely a question for philosophers. I agree. But it is also a question for emergency room doctors and nurses in the Kyoto Second Red Cross Hospital. Thank you. I'll take comments or questions.
I hope it's okay if I. Thank you. John, thank you so much for a very powerful talk. There's so much there. I'm hoping you might help us with connecting a few of the ideas that were toward the middle of the talk with some of your comments at the end about citizenship. One of the feelings, at least, that came through with some of the protagonists in your story was of the heroic. This notion of who gets to be a heroic exemplar of alternatives to this, you would say, the heteronormative the citizen at the center of what the state idealizes. And I'm wondering if maybe you could connect that with notions of hierarchies that are implicit in some of your discussions, hierarchies of ethnicity, social class. In other words, those who might actually, occasion ways of fighting against this normative notion of citizenship. And then what would a sustainable alternative actually look like? Maybe you could help us with some of those issues.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I was in a discussion recently with some writers, and I'm an editor at a literary magazine, and I read about 1,500 short stories a year that are submitted to this journal, and there's no word limit. And I would say 90% of them are about totally, fucked up, dysfunctional families. And so my question to my colleagues was, how has this institution survived hundreds of thousands of years? And it's not as if we haven't tried alternatives. I mean, kibbutz in Israel once tried raising children collectively. As I understand it, that created its own unhappiness. So, I quoted Martha Nussbaum, who said, "I am not an American, I'm a citizen of the world," and that's kind of meaningless. Because to what authority does one appeal, if you are? And I understand that. Part of my personal resistance to the notion of citizenship comes from the fact that my formative years coincided with the years of the Vietnam War, a war which I attended in person. And my antipathy to the notion of being an American, I date back to that. For myself, I certainly want my friends and my family to be employed, but beyond that, I don't feel a particular loyalty to the American worker any more than I feel to the Chinese worker. It gets me in trouble. I don't know what the alternative is. I just don't want to see my particular constituency embrace a rhetoric of exclusion in order to be admitted. That's closing the door behind you. That's what I worry is happening, and is partially why I think so much work, so much money is currently focused on transgender issues, because the door was shut on them by some of the people whose work was formative on me in the 80s and 1990s. I don't know. I didn't know the answer to your question. Wouldn't it be great if I did? I don't know what social formation I'm asking for in lieu of being a citizen, and I definitely, as an American citizen, have demanded the services of the state in my own life. But fine-tuning it as we are now with concepts of intimate citizenship and sex strikes me as kind of a rearguard action to a bigger problem we're not addressing, which is this basic mechanism of abjection in producing the modern citizen. Maybe others have something they want to say to that question. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk today. I was just reading your article you wrote before, the Yoshimoto Banana Rice Home, and that one was focusing on the concept of shoujo in Japan, and it was mentioned in the last part of your talk today. So I wonder, like why is this literary trope of dysfunctional family is so important in Japan that it seems to I don't know, because the logic was sort of circular to me. Like it is confronting the modern family, the concept of family, but it is rhetorically like mentioning family so many times that it seems to like build a family of its own, just like you mentioning that sexual outlaws sort of referring to the concept of citizenship, that it sort of involves in this debate of sexual citizenship. Should we build a sexual nation of our own, that kind of thing? Can you like just shed some light on that?
Yeah, you take me back a few years. Like these 1,500 short stories I read a year, you must be aware that there are no happy families in Japanese literature, ever, until we get to Yoshimoto Banana. And in a novel like Kitchen, it's a transsexual mother managing a family where people are not all blood related. I mean, kazoku has to become family in her discourse, okay? So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the work that you're reading, which was like 1 million years ago, let me just say that when I was writing about the shoujo as a sign, let's say, of productionless consumption in Japan, I didn't really know any shoujo. I mean, I read about them. I mean, I was a grown man, you know. I didn't hang around teenage Japanese girls, and I sort of bought what I read about them, you know, where, you know, they have parfait and tea in cafes, and now I know they're like fucking their brains out. I mean, when you actually meet shoujo, it's a highly sexualized culture, and people like Sharon Kinsella quickly criticized my work for that. It's true. But I will say this, I mean, it's been tried by the Israelis, it's been tried in communist societies, producing a more equitable and just social institution. Hasn't really worked out. I blame heterosexuality. I mean, why not? If you're gonna blame something. There just seems to be something so narcissistic about a biological and social process of reproducing ourselves that, I mean, I think The Onion today had a satirical article on how we now know that every theory of parenting produces equally screwed up kids. Did you see that? Yeah. Could be true. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Last year, I spent most of last year in Japan, in Tokyo, carrying out field work with religious organizations. And one of the groups I spent a lot of time with is Soka Gakkai. And last year, for the first time in 20 years, I was able to spend significant amounts of time with gay and transgender members of Soka Gakkai, which is a large society unto itself, and not an official part of the organization, by choice of the members. For one of the worries is to, if were the group to officially become part of the hierarchy of the religion, it would be subject to instantiating the fears of recruitment and all of the kinds of tropes that still exist within that. But what was really striking to me, especially among the trans folks that I've gotten to know very well, is this palpable desire to have families and kids. Almost everyone wants to get married. Almost everyone wants to raise families in this. And so, but I would push back against the notion that they are not self-aware in the ways that you're talking about. I think many of them are highly educated, many of them are really well read, and more important than that, they're wise because they've lived their own lives and they've seen all kinds of alternative ways of living. And they are, in most cases, choosing to follow in normative forms of citizenship, or at least working as hard as they can against seemingly impossible odds to realize that. So I just wonder if just to take an alternative stance to what you're talking about, they've seen the alternatives, right? They've lived them, and they're just not palpable. They're not attractive. Whereas seeking legal recognition is. And so, what might you respond? How might you respond to folks like that?
Well, ichika bachika. Most things fail. Most things you attempt to do fail. Most of us, I think, are hardwired not to want to be alone. Not all of us, but most of us. And to degrees that we're not even remotely conscious of, we are channeled to cater to that desire for companionship through the family. I have these friends that it starts around this time of year where they start telling me how they loathe the holidays coming up. Thanksgiving, oh, my sister-in-law, I've got to see her again, or my uncle drinks too much, it's horrible, I hate Christmas, I hate Thanksgiving. And my response always is, well, don't go. One great thing about being gay is we have Thanksgiving and Christmas any goddamn time we want. We have it in July, we have it. I said, just don't go. But then the response is, but it's family. And that's a heartfelt comment on it, completely alien to me. But I would like to think that there is something in friendship. I dread the day that the state decides to recognize friendships. And that's where the logic of a lot of marriage equality movement takes us. Why should I have to marry somebody to get her health insurance? Why can't we just be really good friends and extend my benefits? Well, okay, then the state is going to have to issue a certificate that you're friends with this woman, okay? This is where the logic takes us rather than individual enfranchisement. So I don't know. You know what? Karen Nakamura, in her second book on that community of intellectually challenged people in Hokkaido, describes a kind of a social unit, which is never described as a family, but which provides incredible, comfort and succor to these people, often with the blessings of their biological relatives. So we see it. And like I said in my paper, for me in the 80s and 90s, I was talking to a prominent gay writer last year, and we were trying to remember, why weren't we in ACT UP? Why weren't we getting arrested? Why weren't, and both of us had completely blocked out the memory that we were changing our friends' diapers. And we were paying their bills, and we were cleaning their houses. I just completely sort of blocked all of that out. But that was in lieu of, some of these people had been dismissed by their families for a very long time. There was the trauma of coming out, but then there's the trauma of coming out as HIV positive. Too much for too many families to bear. And those were, by necessity, largely, not always, extremely fulfilling relationships for me. Unfortunately, I still don't have those friends because they're gone. But I have no doubt that gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgendered members of Soka Gakkai latch on to the notion of some kind of social formation they can call family, because that word is such a talisman. you know, and not so much kazoku, but, you know, kate, uji, you know, Japanese has a lot of words. Kazoku sounds kind of sociological to me, but, you know, uchi, it's the ultimate uchi group. And so I sympathize with them. My question is, at some point, you're not going to let others into your group. And what do you propose for them? So, yeah.
You talked about loneliness as a big concern. And that made me think about longevity. And that's a new problem that we have. People are living into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Japan has the longest life expectancy in the world, I believe. And a friend of mine was saying to me the other day, who's going to change my diapers when I get dementia? I think that's something we have to factor in now.
Yeah.
You know, as we get older and our friends die off, you want to make sure that somebody you trust is changing your diapers.
Yeah.
You know, and not shipping you off to a graveyard prematurely.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what do you think about? Do you think longevity is changing the way we think about friendship? And
Well, the Japanese certainly talk about it constantly, because they're facing demographic changes perhaps more rapidly than we are. You got to laugh when this proposed solution is robots. You know, oh, let's build robots that can change diapers.
maybe they're more trustworthy.
Then Filipina healthcare workers? I don't think so. I'll take the Filipina healthcare worker, but I'm not Japanese. I mean, they've done polls where like the majority of elderly in Japan are revolted by the notion of being touched by a foreigner. So there's all of it. It's not going to work. I mean, robots are not going to be the solution. Be happy to talk to you afterwards on the particular plans I've made for those years if I'm lucky enough to live that long. I don't know. I mean, the multi-generational household is evaporating everywhere for not always the same reasons, but yes.
Thank you for a great talk. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on sort of how now you see so many different cities in Japan and districts taking on the partnership sort of policy. And my own Japanese hometown, Matsudo city in Chiba, recently made a huge announcement and actually read their PDF document that they're sort of also circulating among city workers. It's like very extensive. It's very interesting. I have a lot of thoughts regarding that, but sort of how that relates to this idea of citizenship and as you mentioned, marriage equality, because it's not marriage, right? But in terms of sexual citizenship, it's kind of a recognition, a weird recognition in the sense that your certain parts of Japan are saying your sexual proclivity is accepted, or as a city we will try to accept you, whether the citizens of that town, whatever they feel about it. Yeah. And these public announcements, especially I see them a lot on Twitter, are kind of interesting sort of places in which I see people responding to that announcement either in praise, but also people seeing like, oh shit, this is coming to my town. Right. So I wondered how you sort of see that in relation to what you talked about today.
That is a really, really good question. And I don't follow local politics in Japan, but I've asked the same question you've asked recently, and I said, are these boroughs in Tokyo, or are these cities with a particular division between political party control? I mean, there are a lot of social democrats, or they're communists. I'm trying to understand this. But once again, I'm getting a sense of deja vu. Why are our rights always negotiated on the basis of a couple? Why is it always recognizing the homosexual couple? I don't have figures on it, but I would be very surprised if the majority of homosexuals, male and female and in between in Japan, like in the United States, live alone. and are not in couples. There's something about a reaffirmation of coupledom, which is somehow we have to offer that up. It's like Mayor Pete, okay? I mean, Mayor Pete joins the U.S. military and fights in Afghanistan. That's very interesting. And then he comes back and he decides he's gay. And the very first person he dates, he marries. I mean, there's no gay adolescence in his life. Okay, it's like checking off a bucket list. I go to Oxford, I go to Harvard, I carry an AK-47 around, and I'm not going to be gay, I'm going to be a married gay. I mean, that's like an immediate, I mean, this is, people like Sarah Schulman have written about this. This is what we have to do to get back in social good graces after a quarter century of us being looked at as contaminated, infected with a fatal illness because we like butt fucking. Not to put too fine a word on it, but when Dale Peck, who's one of the great critics I think we have in this country, published an article about Mayor Pete, and he said, I wonder whether he's a top or a bottom. People went nuts. People went crazy. I mean, there were death threats against Dale Peck because we can't sexualize Mayor Pete. Okay, that he's married to a white man who almost looks like him. You know, that's as far as we're going to go. All right. You know, I believe that people should be. I'm a civil libertarian at heart. I believe people should do anything they want. Want to get married? Fine. Go to a church. Go to a temple. Do whatever you want. It's the distribution of social goods on the basis of marital status that bother me, and it seems to me that recognizing civil partnerships in Japan, it's a feel-good moment, but it's postponing a bigger reckoning on what is the political enfranchisement of us before the family as individuals. I mean, still, as I'm no doubt aware, so many homosexuals in Japan, when they come out, they leave. They leave.
So I'd like to thank Professor Treat for a very thought-provoking talk and a very interesting discussion. So can we give an applause?
Thank you.